The people of Waverly Hollow spoke of the Waverly daughters in lowered voices, as though their very names might stir something resting beneath the soil. For 3 generations the girls were all born the same, quiet, pale, and blind, their milky eyes drifting toward sound but never toward light. Outsiders pitied them, whispered about curses, but within the walls of Waverly Manor the blindness was simply a fact of life, something the family carried with a strange and almost ritualistic acceptance. The youngest daughter, Elara, had always felt different, though she could never explain why. While her sisters moved carefully through rooms they memorized by touch, Elara often paused in doorways, sensing something the others couldn't. There were moments when she felt warmth where there should be cold, shadows where there should be nothing. Her mother brushed it off as imagination. Blind children often created worlds inside their minds. But Elara knew the difference between imagination and intrusion. And something had been intruding for years. It happened on a rain-thick night, when the wind pressed against the windows like a warning. Elara sat awake in her room, listening to the soft breaths of the manor settling around her, when a strange pressure built behind her eyes. At first, she thought it was another headache. Then light, real light, exploded through her skull. She gasped, clawing at her face as every nerve came alive with a sense she had never experienced. Shapes surged into existence. Walls. A door. The outline of her own trembling hands. And then something else, something towering, formless, and impossibly close, watching her with an attention that felt ancient and hungry. She saw it only for a heartbeat. Just long enough for it to change her forever. Her vision collapsed. Darkness returned. But her scream echoed through every hallway of Waverly Manor, waking her sisters and pulling her mother from sleep. The moment they reached her room, Elara could no longer speak. She only pointed at the far corner, her breath shuddering, trying to name what she had witnessed, trying to explain that the darkness she lived with all her life had finally shown her something no human should ever see. The birth of every Waverly daughter carried a tension that could be felt long before labor pains began, a quiet dread that settled over the manor like dust on forgotten furniture. 4 generations, the same pattern repeated itself with chilling precision. Each girl entered the world with eyes that never opened to light. Midwives who assisted the births described an eerie calm, as if the infants already knew the world they were arriving into, as if they had grown accustomed to darkness before ever taking their first breath. Physicians from nearby towns were brought in to study them, to search for a rational explanation, but no medical test uncovered any genetic flaw, no damaged tissue, no nerve endings that could explain their blindness. Their eyes simply refused to awaken, as though sealed by something older than biology. The family tried to pretend it was manageable, perhaps even normal, but every whisper behind closed doors betrayed their fear. The blindness wasn't random, and it wasn't inherited in any conventional way. It was a signature, a mark stamped onto every girl born to the Waverly bloodline. The villagers often speculated about curses or old sins, claiming the family had angered something they should never have crossed, yet no one knew the origin of the condition. Within the manor, the parents spoke little of it, choosing silence over confrontation. Each child was raised gently, taught to navigate corridors by touch and sound, guided by routines so old they predated even the grandparents' memories. All the while, the daughters adapted to their shared darkness with a strange ease, as if they were not missing sight but had been shaped for a different sensory world entirely. They moved as though guided by instinct, hearing things others could not, noticing subtle shifts in air and temperature with unnerving accuracy. What outsiders saw as disability, the family quietly recognized as something else, an inheritance neither blessed nor cursed, but deliberate. Still, with every new pregnancy, the same anxiety returned. The mother braced herself for the moment the newborn's eyelids fluttered and revealed the familiar clouded irises. The father gripped her hand, pretending hope while expecting disappointment. By the time the 5th daughter was born blind, even the oldest relatives stopped pretending it was chance. The pattern was too precise, too anchored in something the family refused to discuss. There were fragments of stories, mentions of an ancestor who had made a promise, but no one dared piece them together. Over the years, the blindness became a quiet omen, a reminder that the family carried a history they could not escape, and that whatever had touched the bloodline had no intention of letting go. Elara's earliest memories were filled with sounds, textures, and subtle movements in the air that only she seemed to notice, but it wasn't until she turned 7 that something shifted in a way no one in the Waverly family could ignore. Unlike her sisters, who accepted their darkness with a serene understanding, Elara always tilted her head toward windows as though listening for something beyond sound. She couldn't see, yet she behaved as if light itself whispered to her. Her mother often found her sitting on the floor near the sunlit corridor, hands hovering above the warm wooden boards, her face turned upward like a child waiting for a secret to reveal itself. At first, they assumed it was just her imagination, a habit born from curiosity, but then small reactions began to emerge, reactions no blind child should have had. It started with the flicker of a candle. During a family dinner, her father lit a single taper on the table. As the flame danced, Elara's head jerked subtly toward it, her unseeing eyes narrowing as if something had brushed against her awareness. No one spoke, but the parents exchanged a glance that held both hope and fear. Days later, sunlight streaming through a window made her flinch, though she insisted she had not seen anything. Her mother waved her hand slowly in front of Elara's face, not expecting a response, but to her shock, the girl's breath hitched, and her chin lifted slightly, following the movement as though sensing a shape passing through brightness. Doctors returned, their instruments cold and clinical against Elara's skin. They ran tests, shone lights directly into her eyes, and asked her to describe things she couldn't possibly see. Every result came back unchanged. Elara was still blind by every measurable standard. Her optic nerves showed no improvement, her pupils reacted to nothing, and her brain scans displayed no indication of visual processing. Yet her reactions continued, small but unmistakable. She could sense illumination the way someone might sense a shift in temperature, except what she felt was sharper, more precise, as if light itself had a presence she had begun to detect. Her sisters noticed it too. They heard the slight intake of breath whenever she walked past a bright window. They felt her pause at the threshold of sunlit rooms, as though she were stepping into a place not meant for her. Whispers began circulating through the manor, the kind of fearful murmurs that traveled quickly in old houses already heavy with secrets. Elara's strange sensitivity unsettled everyone because it suggested that the family's long-standing blindness was no longer a constant. Something had changed. Something was waking inside the youngest daughter, something that paid no attention to science, reason, or the boundaries of the world they thought they understood. The night Elara finally saw for the first time began with an unease she could not explain, a tension that crawled beneath her skin like an invisible warning. The manor was quiet, the kind of silence that settled heavily after midnight when every room held its breath. Elara lay awake, tracing the patterns on her blanket with her fingertips, trying to distract herself from the strange pressure building behind her eyes. It wasn't painful at first, just a dull throb that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She assumed it was one of her usual headaches, the kind she often got when the weather shifted, but this one felt different, as if something inside her was pushing outward. Her sisters slept in the adjoining room, unaware of the shift in the air, unaware of the moment their world would tilt toward something none of them had ever faced. The pressure grew until it became a sharp, searing heat, and Elara grabbed her head, gasping as the darkness she had always known began to crack around her. A thin blade of brightness sliced through the void, shocking her senses, and she instinctively squeezed her eyes shut even though she had lived her entire life without needing to do so. Light flooded her mind in sudden, overwhelming waves, forming shapes and lines she had no experience interpreting. Her heart pounded wildly as her brain tried to make sense of something it had never processed before. Walls emerged, dim and blurred. The shadows of her furniture wavered like living things. The outline of her own trembling hands appeared in front of her, each finger shaking as if they belonged to someone else. She had no vocabulary for sight, no framework for the chaos that assaulted her nerves, only the instinctive terror of being thrust into a world she was never meant to perceive. But then, something else materialized, something no child should ever witness. As her vision sharpened for a fleeting, impossible moment, a figure coalesced in the far corner of the room. It was tall, its edges indistinct, as though it were made of the same darkness she had lived in all her life but now shaped into something sentient. It did not move, yet she felt its attention pressing on her like cold weight. Eyes, if they were eyes, glimmered faintly within the shifting shadow, watching her with a hunger that froze her breath. Her scream tore through the silence, raw and instinctive, not just from fear but from the certainty that the thing she saw had been waiting for her vision to awaken. The light vanished as quickly as it came, plunging her back into familiar darkness, but the memory of that silhouette burned into the center of her mind with a clarity she could not erase. The discovery of the hidden room began with an accident, the kind that should have been forgettable but instead rewrote the Waverly family's understanding of their own home. In the days following Elara's terrifying vision, the manor felt unsettled. Floorboards creaked where they never had before, drafts slipped through cracks that didn't exist the week prior, and even the air seemed to hum with a low, restless vibration. Elara's older sister, Marin, wandered the upstairs hallway one afternoon, running her hand along the wall as she often did to center herself. But this time, her palm brushed against a seam she had never felt before, a faint line in the wallpaper that didn't match the layout of the house they'd memorized since childhood. She paused, pressing her ear to the wall, sensing a hollow space behind it. Her heart quickened, not from fear but instinct, the same instinct that guided all the Waverly daughters through the darkness. When their mother arrived, she tried to dismiss the girl's discovery, insisting the manor was simply settling with age. But Elara felt something else, something pulling her attention toward that hidden seam as surely as the light had drawn her days earlier. Their father reluctantly fetched a small tool and pried at the edge of the wall, and with a soft groan, the concealed panel loosened. A cold breath of air wafted out, older than dust, older than the house itself. Behind the wall lay a narrow passage that descended into darkness, a forgotten corridor built with stone rather than wood, as though it belonged to a structure that predated the rest of the manor. The adults hesitated at the threshold, but the girls sensed no choice in the matter. Something buried in their family's past was finally demanding to be seen, even if they could not see it with their eyes. Inside, the passage opened into a small chamber, not much larger than a closet. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with journals bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed and brittle. A single lantern sat on a table, untouched by dust, as though waiting to be lit despite decades, perhaps more, of abandonment. Their father lifted the topmost journal, his hands trembling as he flipped through entries written in a rushed and uneven hand. The words spoke of rituals, of bargains struck for protection, of a presence that demanded offerings in exchange for peace. There were references to daughters born blind, to a lineage marked by shadows, and to a promise made by an ancestor who believed he was saving the family from something he could not fully name. Each sentence deepened the unease in the small room, wrapping around the family like a tightening rope. The journals didn't explain Elara's sudden vision, but they made one thing horrifyingly clear: whatever she had seen had roots not in madness or imagination, but in a past the Waverleys had spent generations trying to bury. In the days after the hidden room was uncovered, the atmosphere within Waverly Manor shifted in ways the sisters could feel but not fully articulate. The journals their father read left the adults shaken and distant, offering no reassurance and creating a tense silence that hung over the household like a storm cloud refusing to break. Yet it wasn't the adults who sensed the most change, it was the daughters, whose blindness had always made them more attuned to the subtle patterns of their environment. What began with Elara's vision soon evolved into something that touched all 5 sisters, binding them in a shared unease none of them had ever experienced before. At first, it came as faint tremors beneath the floorboards, gentle vibrations so delicate they might have been mistaken for a passing cart on the distant road. But the Waverly daughters knew every sound and whisper of the manor intimately, and these vibrations were not the familiar creaks of old wood but something rhythmic, intentional, almost alive. Marin was the first to mention it aloud, her voice trembling as she admitted she felt something pulsing through the walls, a sensation she couldn't explain. The others soon confessed similar experiences, a faint hum that resonated in their bones, a shifting pressure that seemed to follow them from room to room, and the unsettling sense that the house was no longer just a place they lived in but a body reacting to something stirring within it. They tried to rationalize it, telling themselves it was only the aftermath of Elara's vision or the discovery of the hidden chamber, but the sensations did not fade. If anything, they grew stronger with each passing day. At night, when the house settled and the halls grew still, the vibrations intensified until the girls found themselves lying awake, hands pressed to the floor or walls, feeling the manor breathe with a slow, unnatural cadence. What frightened them most was that Elara, whose brief vision remained a haunting mystery, was not the only one sensing something beyond the physical anymore. Her sisters began hearing faint whispers at the edges of their perception, whispers they couldn't translate but recognized as something not meant for human ears. Sometimes the air thickened around them, carrying a coldness that made their skin prickle. Other times they felt compelled to turn their heads toward corners they couldn't see, corners that felt suddenly occupied. They never spoke these details to their parents, sensing instinctively that this was not something adults could help with, not something reason or comfort could solve. The sisters clung to each other more closely, moving together through the manor as if their unity offered protection from whatever had awakened. They understood without needing sight that their bond was changing, deepening, as if the darkness they had lived with all their lives was beginning to echo with something new, something ancient, something that recognized them more intimately than they wished to be known. The northern wing of Waverly Manor had always been off-limits, a place spoken of only in warnings whispered by parents who refused to explain why the doors remained locked and the halls beyond left to rot. The sisters had grown up accepting the rule as they accepted their blindness without question, because questioning never led anywhere safe. But after Elara's vision and the strange vibrations rippling through the walls, the forbidden wing no longer felt like a distant part of the house. It felt present, listening, almost aware of them in a way no ordinary space should be. The cold drafts that seeped from beneath its sealed door carried the same unnerving heaviness as the chamber where the journals were found, as though the two spaces were connected by something deeper than architecture. Elara began feeling an inexplicable pull toward that wing, a subtle tug in her chest that grew stronger each day. It wasn't curiosity or rebellion, it felt like recognition, as if something beyond the door was waiting specifically for her. When she passed by the northern corridor, her breath hitched, and the air thinned around her in a way she could physically feel, like standing at the edge of a deep drop. Her sisters noticed it too, the strange tension that gathered whenever she drew near that part of the manor. They sensed the cold before they reached the door, a cold that didn't belong to winter or shadow but something much older. Even the floor beneath their feet felt wrong, as though the boards lay over a hollow space that pulsed faintly with every vibration they'd been feeling throughout the house. Late one night, when the rest of the manor slept uneasily, a soft scraping sound echoed from the northern wing, too deliberate to be wind or settling wood. The sisters, wide awake and tense from the vibrations that had been building all evening, listened in frozen silence as the scraping grew into a slow, dragging movement along the other side of the locked door. Elara rose from her bed without understanding why, her feet carrying her toward the source as if responding to a silent summons. Her sisters followed instinctively, their movements coordinated by fear and something deeper, a shared sense that whatever lay beyond that door was no longer content to remain hidden. When Elara reached the sealed entrance, her hand lifted on its own, trembling as her fingers touched the cold wood. The moment skin met surface, a jolt of icy pressure shot up her arm, not painful but paralyzing in its intensity. The vibrations, usually subtle and scattered, surged through the manor in a sharp, unified tremor, like a massive exhale from something waking after a long sleep. The door remained locked, unmoving, but the presence behind it pressed forward with unmistakable awareness, acknowledging Elara in a way that made her blood run cold. For the first time, she understood that the forbidden wing had never been abandoned, it had been contained, and whatever lived there had just noticed her. The truth of the Waverly family's curse revealed itself slowly, like a whisper drifting through the corridors of Waverly Manor, growing louder with each passing day. Their mother had resisted speaking of it, her voice always tight, her hands shaking when the subject approached, but after Elara's vision and the unnerving changes that swept through the household, silence became impossible. One evening, while the sisters sat together near the hearth, their mother's composure broke. Her eyes, usually guarded and calm, flickered with an emotion the daughters had never seen, fear edged with resignation. She spoke hesitantly at first, each word weighed down by generations of guilt and secrecy, revealing that the family's affliction was no accident, no cruel trick of genetics, but a deliberate act of someone who had lived centuries before them. Long ago, she explained, an ancestor of the Waverly bloodline had bargained with a presence older than the house, older than the village, something that existed beyond the limits of mortal understanding. In his desperation to protect the family from famine, plague, or some nameless threat, he had struck a bargain promising that the Waverly name would endure, that their lives would be shielded from ruin, but the cost was precise and cruel. Every daughter born to the family would be denied sight, their eyes sealed by the invisible hand of the entity, as a mark of the debt owed. It was not punishment but protection twisted into a form the human mind could scarcely reconcile, a gift that demanded a sacrifice too great to explain, a price that bound the family to shadows. Elara's mother spoke of fear, of generations raising daughters who could never see, and of the quiet compliance that had come to define their lives. She described the rituals performed in hushed secrecy, small acts of appeasement, offerings whispered to shadows in darkened rooms, never fully understood, yet believed to maintain the bargain. She admitted that no one had questioned the arrangement for centuries, for fear that breaking the unspoken rules might awaken consequences beyond their imagination. The journals discovered in the hidden room had hinted at this truth, but hearing it directly from the source gave the words a gravity the daughters could feel in their bones. The family's blindness, their carefully maintained routines, the house itself, all had been shaped by this ancient promise, a contract with a presence that demanded obedience and thrived on silence. As their mother's confession unfolded, the sisters realized that Elara's awakening, her brief and terrifying sight, was not an accident but a rupture in the covenant. Something had shifted, something that the family had kept at bay for generations, and her vision had called it to attention. The story of the bargain was no longer merely a tale of the past, it was a warning that the cost of breaking the rules, or even inadvertently stepping beyond them, was not hypothetical. The entity their ancestor had bargained with had not forgotten, and it was watching, waiting, and aware that one of the daughters had glimpsed what should never have been seen. Elara's brief vision had done more than terrify her, it had awakened something that had slept in the corners of Waverly Manor for generations, something the family had thought safely contained. For weeks after that night, the atmosphere in the house seemed charged, as though every shadow had grown heavier, every floorboard more deliberate in its creak, every gust of wind carrying a whisper that pressed against the walls. The presence that had once been a distant threat, kept at bay by the old bargains and rituals, had stirred. It moved silently through the manor, unseen but unmistakably aware of Elara's newfound sight. The girls felt it in tremors beneath their feet, in the subtle brush of air against their skin, and in the way the darkness seemed to shift when they passed through a room, folding around them like an attentive, predatory cloak. The entity did not communicate in language humans could understand. Its actions were subtle yet deliberate, a careful choreography of pressure and omission that left the sisters disoriented and anxious. Doors would be found ajar that had been locked the night before. Items they had left in one place would appear elsewhere, arranged in ways that suggested intention. Elara's own reactions became a measure of the entity's awareness. Her breath would hitch without reason, her pulse would race, and the very air around her would thrum with energy. It was as if the house itself had become an extension of the presence, every shadow a limb, every draft of finger tracing patterns only she could feel. The entity had awakened, and it was sizing up the family, testing the boundaries of its old containment. The other daughters, though still blind, began to notice changes in their own perception. The vibrations that had been subtle began to intensify, carrying with them a sense of urgency, almost as if the manor itself was alerting them to danger. They started sensing movements in the corners of rooms that they could not see, feeling shifts in the air that suggested something watching. Even without sight, they could feel the entity's attention, as if it were a tide of awareness pressing against their senses. The house, once a predictable landscape of familiar walls and rooms, had transformed into a labyrinth of unseen threats, each shadow a possible doorway for whatever had been stirred by Elara's awakening. The parents, now aware that the awakening was more than a fleeting anomaly, struggled to understand the scale of what had been unleashed. Their attempts to rationalize or suppress it were met with resistance. The presence seemed impervious to human reasoning or control. Elara's sight had acted as a catalyst, reactivating the dormant force, reminding it that the family it had long bound to silence was vulnerable, exposed. The realization settled over the Waverleys like a weight. Whatever their ancestor had bargained for, whatever protections they had relied on, was no longer guaranteed. The entity had returned, and it was no longer content to remain hidden in the shadows. After the entity awakened, the Waverly sisters began experiencing a strange and disorienting shift in their own perception, a sensory blending that none of them had anticipated. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a faint taste of shadows on the tongue, a soft warmth that seemed to hum through the floorboards, vibrations that carried meaning if they listened closely. Each sister, still blind, felt the world differently, as though the boundaries between senses had begun to dissolve. Marin, usually the most cautious, discovered that she could sense shapes in the darkness, not with her eyes, which had never seen, but with a combination of touch, sound, and a strange awareness of presence that felt almost like sight. A door across the hall, previously a mere silhouette in her imagination, now had edges she could feel in the air, the shape of the frame pressed into her consciousness without ever touching it. Elara's awakening had not been isolated, it had rippled outward, and the sisters found themselves linked in ways that defied explanation. One would feel a cold draft brushing her neck, and another would feel it simultaneously across the floor, even when she was nowhere near the source. Whispers and half-formed sounds seemed to flow from one sister to another, as though their minds were brushing against each other across the void of darkness. Shadows became tangible to them, taking on weight and substance, shifting in the corners of rooms, moving in tandem with something unseen that seemed to feed on their growing awareness. The manor, once merely a home, had transformed into a living organism, its heartbeat synchronized with the sisters' heightened perception. The entity's presence influenced these changes, drawing out abilities they had never imagined. Objects seemed to resonate under their touch or near their proximity, vibrating with subtle currents of energy. Air currents carried impressions, a language of movement and pressure that only they could interpret. Their senses were no longer independent, they overlapped, entwined with one another in a network of perception that blurred the line between the physical and the metaphysical. Every corridor, every hallway, every room became a map of sensation, a lattice of light, sound, and shadow that the sisters navigated instinctively. Yet this awakening brought fear as much as power. The sisters realized that the entity was not passive, it observed, testing the limits of what they could sense and how far their new awareness extended. Every overlap of perception was a reminder that they were intruding into a space not meant for human understanding. Their blindness, once a shield against the world, had been replaced by a different vulnerability, one that exposed them to the lingering presence of something ancient and relentless. As they adapted to their shifting senses, they could feel the weight of the entity's attention, a constant pressure that promised awareness without mercy, and they knew that the boundary between what they could sense and what was sensing them was growing thinner with every passing moment. Elara's final revelation came on a night thick with fog and silence, when the manor itself seemed to hold its breath. The past weeks of subtle vibrations, whispered movements, and overlapping senses had built to a tense crescendo, leaving the sisters restless and wary. Elara felt it most acutely, a tightness in her chest that pulled her toward the northern wing, toward the sealed door that had always loomed like a barrier between the known and the forbidden. Every instinct screamed for caution, yet she could not resist the force drawing her forward, a magnetic tug that promised answers even as it threatened danger. As she stepped into the hallway, the air thickened, carrying a weight that pressed against her skin and tugged at her awareness. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, bending toward her as though the manor itself was guiding her, steering her toward something long concealed. When she reached the threshold of the northern wing, a strange clarity settled over her senses. It was not merely sight that returned, brief as it had been before, but a perception that transcended the physical. She could feel the entity's awareness like a living pulse, each heartbeat of its presence echoing in the spaces around her. She realized, with a sudden and chilling certainty, that what she had glimpsed weeks earlier was not a fleeting vision or hallucination. It had been a warning, a communication that she could not ignore. The shadowy figure she had seen had existed for centuries, bound to the Waverly bloodline, and now that she had awakened her sight even briefly, it had begun to stir with intent. Every tremor through the floor, every whisper of air, every subtle shift of shadow in the manor was part of its message, a prelude to something far larger than the family had imagined. Elara's sisters pressed close, their heightened senses alert to the presence before them, feeling its movements through vibrations and currents they had never known existed. They understood, without seeing, that the entity's attention was singularly focused on Elara, but that the consequences would touch them all. The realization struck with both awe and terror. The vision had not been accidental. It was a trigger, a catalyst that had broken the fragile equilibrium maintained for generations. The entity did not merely observe, it acted, and its actions were guided by a logic older than humanity, a need that demanded response. Elara could feel its awareness probing the family, measuring their weaknesses and the bonds that connected them. The warnings embedded in the journals, the secrecy of generations, the blindness that had shielded them all were parts of a containment that had been breached. In that moment, standing on the threshold of the forbidden wing, Elara understood the weight of the family's history and the fragility of their present. The entity had not forgotten the bargain struck centuries ago, and it had returned not to threaten in vague terms, but to enforce a reality none of them could fully comprehend. The house trembled with anticipation, shadows stretched in acknowledgement, and the sisters, linked by their shared senses and unspoken fear, realized that the unseen presence was no longer dormant. Whatever it was aware, it was waiting, and it had marked them all as part of a reckoning that was only just beginning.